Okay, well, welcome everybody as we get ready to talk about chapter 7. I did want to highlight one thing we did not do in chapter 6, which is the word host. And that's really important in my thinking, because one of the earliest epithets for God is the Lord of hosts. Mm-hmm. And just what the author reminds us, right, is the host is a military quantity akin to a legion. And again, just helps create some context for that we use. The heavenly host does not mean like angels waiting. It means like 2,000 armed soldiers, essentially, and their baggage train. Do I think that exists? No, but that is the language that gets used to describe God. So that's important. Maybe nobody else cares about that, or that was enough. So let me just open the floor to your thoughts on these practices and objects. And particularly this week, we got to read about remembering covenants, walking, horses, gates, and houses. Was there anything that stood out for you, or like helped you do a double take on something you've read before? Or yeah, maybe, you know, that's a purposefully vague and awful question. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'll start with one I was struggling with, Mike, which is remembering, and that I get this kind of the sense of what he's driving for, but I'm having a really hard time coming up with an English equivalent for, you know, it's clearly more than, you know, remembering what 2 times 3 is, but how to translate the rest of it, I'm really struggling with. Anybody have any good thoughts on that?
I don't have like the definitive answer, but the one that sort of I have come out with is to really be like, what do I want to say? Like draconian with the word and the stem. So a member is like your arm. And if you dismember it, you cut it off. And when you put it back on, you remember it. So I think the idea is like, instead of the recall of a fact, it's sort of making whole something that had the unity of which had been threatened.
I'm wondering if perhaps what it might mean also is it's the plea of a person saying, dear God, I know that I've done wrong or sinned, or whatever terms you want to use. Please, you know, don't forget me. Please remember me. So I see it as a plea in many instances to God, please don't forget me. Remember me. I love you.
I remember a quote. I'm sorry, Darlene. I'll be real quick. I remember a quote in the book where he mentions there's 3 aspects for it. One is to bring to mind. The second one is to reflect on it. And the third is to take action. So it's kind of all those 3 elements, which we only really consider the first one, you know, to bring to mind. Darlene, I'm sorry.
I think of it as having not only the intellectual content of remembering, like Antha said, but it has a heart part of it too. The relational part. Mm-hmm. Not only do we remember in our head, but it's our heart. And there's that, like Mike said, that remembering, rejoining the body, rejoining the relationship.
Well, I'm wondering, in some cultures you could like turn your back on someone to cut them, to ignore them, and so it's this, and the opposite of that, which we don't really have a word for, but to don't turn your back on me, the kind of following up on how Meg was thinking.
The fact that we have to explain all of this and define it in our terms is indicative for me of, we don't have, like Antha said, we don't have a word. We have to build a concept for our culture.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. As Mike was talking about party, because this is all about words, and I thought, if times continue as they are, we pretty soon will have to start explaining to future generations what a party was. You know,
She's
things
editing all the way
change.
over in the UK. Can't be.
Things change over time as these words have changed over time for us, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting that we have to think back on how they would have thought about it to really get the full
Yeah.
depth of what was meant.
Yeah, I hope it's helpful. I really think that's helpful, Donna, and to think through biblically that this happens a whole lot. I mean, when you read, for example, Exodus or Deuteronomy, it's laid out to the people that there are festivals you have to keep. You have to keep the Passover, you have to keep the Sukkot, you have to do it every year, and you have to circumcise your sons on the 8th day, right? These are things you have to do. And then what I think is really interesting is that you get to these key moments, like Joshua is getting ready to take the people in the promised land, and lo and behold, they haven't been keeping Passover. I mean, these are the people who came out of Egypt, and they haven't been doing it. None of them had circumcised their kids, none of them. They hadn't kept the Sukkot, you know, and that happens throughout the Hebrew Bible, is that there's these key events you're supposed to do, and lo and behold, like people do them and then they don't remember to do them. And it's not that they sort of forgot a fact, it's that they didn't tie in that this was significant and part of their own story. And I don't know if it's okay to say, but you know, like my son was born in 2000, the year 2000, and he has no connection with 9/11. I don't know that he should, but to remember that would be connecting him with this part of a story that's core to his world or American identity, you know, that's not just a fact, but it's a part of like what it means to be a person, right? And I have to say, I think like D-Day that's a fading one. You know, I don't see that people under the age of 35, I mean, maybe they know what it is, but it's not like this monumental day like it was for my mother, whose father was a barber in the Pacific. You know what I mean? Like I think there's these, and it becomes really hard. Like, how do you remember that? And today we're supposed to remember our baptism, right? Which is not like remember we were baptized, but reattach ourselves to this sort of sacramental opportunity. I don't know if you've done, most of you have done this, I know, because we've done it together before, but you know, every Passover, you do this meal called the Seder, and in some ways, it depends what kind of Jew you are. It doesn't matter what you eat or not. It should, but you eat these foods as a way of remembering the experiences, like in a very tactile way, of your ancestors, and you say, "We were slaves in Egypt, and God delivered us." And that like key turn of phrase, it's very different from once upon a time, our ancestors were slaves and God delivered them. The phrase is, we were slaves and God delivered us. And I know that's just a small turn of phrase, but it seems like that's the way the rite is supposed to work, is for us to remember ourselves in the deliverance story and the bondage story, even if we weren't in Egypt long ago.
Hey, Mike?
Yes, sir.
I find it interesting that that we were kind of talking about this word, because it reminds me of the I guess it's our Eucharist.
Yeah.
Eucharist prayer being, I guess, the other prayers is where we talk, where to quote it, take, eat, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this for the remembrance of me. Same thing with the wine. I've always thought of that in terms of putting back together.
Well, and thanks, John. And you know, Nick pointed this out to me. This is really good, right? This was part of the Anglican compromise between Catholic and low symbolic Protestant, right, is this is my body. There's the Catholic part. Do this in remembrance of me. That's the symbolic part, which puts us really as the bridge between the two, right? It's a remembrance and it's the real presence. But that's the interesting thing, right, is when you put those together, it is, like you say, I think it's a great way to think about how it is we remember. And, you know, it's sad that it's so tough, right? Because I could go in my clericals to a Roman Catholic church and they shouldn't serve me communion and I shouldn't take it. And that's a strange remembrance, if you don't mind me saying. I don't want to throw any shade. I get the theology behind it, and at the same time, I don't get it. Because what are you choosing to remember, right? And this, I think, is the invitation, is like how we do these things is really important. Because at the end of the day, Judas was at the Last Supper.
Yeah.
So look, if you include that guy, who are you going to exclude? Non-baptized Christians. Really? I mean, if you're going to include the guy who turned him over, really, you're going to exclude people? I mean, I think that I really think that matters. You know?
Yes, I think it matters too. And I don't understand the Romans doing what they're doing, but there's a lot of corruption in the Roman Catholic Church these days. And so I think they're really off the track in so many ways. And I would hope that Pope Francis would change that rule, but I don't think he said anything about it, but I think it's deplorable.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I do want to be quick to second, like the Episcopal Church is full of corruption too. But as I like to joke, we have unclad our dumpster, you know, because we're going to reclad it. But hey, we're open with our garbage. I'm kidding a little bit, right? Like we don't hide our garbage in the back. It's right there when you come up front. And actually, that's probably not a bad way to live. It's by just going ahead and putting your garbage in the front of the place as a metaphor for life. And that, you know, hopefully doesn't block people from the sanctuary that's within. But this whole remembrance thing is, to me, seems really critical to sacramentality and practice. Yeah.
Don't you think that's why you talked about, like, you know, D-Day and things like that? Don't you think that's why that we've gotten into doing so many museums for the Holocaust, for other things? And it's so that people don't forget what really happened.
Donna, could you turn up your mic a little bit, please?
Sorry, it's as loud as it'll go. I'm
That's good.
sorry. I think that the people who have experienced these things are very instrumental in doing these museums and to not let certain facts, both good and bad, be forgotten.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and then the question is, like, who visits them? And is this a visit like, oh, like interesting part of the past, or is it like a connection with the fabric of humanity? You know, and like, I think if you leave the Holocaust Museum and you say, I can't believe those people did that, then you didn't interact with it correctly. I mean, I really think that. I will tell you, my interaction is, I can't believe those people did that. And I'm not really sure that's the point of the curation. I think the curation is to say, like, that could be you. Your best thinking could get you there. So you've got to be, the point of this museum is to inspire you, not to look at this as a past event, but so that you will remember. Maybe that was weird.
That was good, Mike.
I will tell you, I was living in Germany when a film came out called The Downfall in English. In German, it's Der Untergang. And it's the last 2 weeks of Hitler's life. And Germans went crazy about it because it showed Hitler, like, the last 2 weeks of his life, like being nice to his secretary. And the objection was, like, he is the embodiment of evil. So don't humanize that guy. But, you know, and as Americans, actually, like, we had no problem, we just translated it, you know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. When you totally strip somebody of their humanity, when you dismember them as being a human being, it doesn't seem like a good way to deal with it. And by the way, politically, we're dealing with that right now. And I still think it's really interesting that people will make these claims about politicians that they've never met in person. Like, how can you say that with authority, that this person is so-and-so? You don't know them. You know their public persona and their image. You can say, I don't like the policies they support, but to say somebody is a such and such, like how can you say that? I mean, I know people that radically dislike decisions I make, and they don't know me. You know, and maybe it would harden their will even more if they got to know me. But like, we all know that. We've all been like, people have said, oh, she dresses like this, or she does that, or he's like this. And it's like, you can't make that claim about me. Like, you don't have any relational skin in the game. And I think remembering, if we properly do it, is about that. Please.
Going back to just a little bit to what you indicated, that remembering involves integrating that into our life. On page 100, there's a statement, as with God, remembering isn't merely bringing something to mind. It also entails reflecting on what comes to mind and then acting accordingly. And that brings us back to the trilogy of thinking, feeling, and doing. We're integrated. If we do those three things, we integrate our faith into our total being, which is thinking, feeling, and doing.
Yeah, thank you. You know, he makes another phrase that I just want to offer a word on. The Jewish garment, many of you know this, called a talit. It has 613 tassels on it. That's one for each one of the mitzvot. There are 248 don'ts, like don't eat pork, for example, and 365 do's. And you wear that all the time to remind you of the Torah. And you know, there's this really interesting story about this woman who's been hemorrhaging for a long time. And she goes around to touch Jesus, and she touches him on the fringe of his garment. She touches him on one of these tassels. And what's curious, right, is according to the tassels, you don't touch people who are unclean. And Matthew's got that in mind, right? I mean, she touches the tassel that forbids her from touching, and she's made well. And I think that ties in really well with like inclusion and sacraments, right? Do we want to move on and talk about our next word, which is covenants? And I just want to underscore that covenants are not made linguistically; they're cut. Always cut. So you can't make the covenant of circumcision. You cut that covenant literally. And like when you hear about Noah making a covenant with God, an animal dies, right? And when Abraham makes a covenant with God, the image is that Abraham takes this like heifer and cuts it in half from like tip to tail, and then walks through the pieces. And if you read that story of Abraham's covenant with God, supposedly God walks through the pieces too. And this is this really old image that says, hey, if you don't keep your end of the deal, you're going to be like this animal. This really strong image where like you don't like pinky swear, you cut something in half. We don't do that anymore. I'm kind of grateful, but you need to hear like biblically, people talk about marriage as a covenant. No, it isn't. I have never been to a marriage where anything gets cut up. So categorically, marriage is not a covenant. It's a solemn promise, but we don't do this. I'm not saying we should. I just want you to hear we don't do this.
So Mike, going back to something I said last week, so like cutting up a part of your herd, that's an expensive thing to do.
Yes.
So how often were covenants, like real covenants involving cutting, actually made?
You'd think pretty scarcely, right? And the kind of covenants we have example from, they tend to be in general these, like, they're called suzerainty covenants. You can read all this literature about it. A suzerain is a lord, like an earl or a baron, and you covenant to live together. You probably do end up eating that animal after you cut it because it's too precious to waste. But it is a lot. I mean, it's a material cost. How often does that happen? Well, maybe it happens as often as you have a new lord, which is probably not very often. And by the way, if you're like a conquering host, like you're Nebuchadnezzar and you've subdued all the people, you're not going to make a covenant with them. You already cut your covenant in their blood. I mean, you already killed all those people. Like, that's the covenant. And it goes like this: do what I say or I'll kill you too. Like, you make covenants with slaves, and it really looks like, do what I say or you die. And this happens a couple other ways. If you've read the Hebrew Bible, you hear like you have to redeem the firstborn child. Redeem, because it belongs to God. Do you know this language? Redeeming the firstborn? The ancient Canaanite practice is that you take your firstborn child and like burn it to death as a way of making covenant with a deity, like called Chemosh or Molech or Milcom. Basically, your firstborn male child is like the most valuable commodity you can possess. So you're kind of obligating the deity to give you something really valuable in return, like protection or victory. Some of the Hebrew kings do this, like Hezekiah's son Manasseh does this, and he's judged like the most wicked king ever for doing it. Turns out he has a really long reign and is pretty successful. But this is like a really gross, detestable thing. But the idea is that he's making a covenant with the god Chemosh or Molech, but instead of just cutting, like it's incineration. Think of the word Holocaust, which means a total offering, like a burned offering, so nobody gets to eat that. Like you absolutely convert something valuable into being something completely useless. Maybe you could say when you buy a really expensive wedding band, that's part of covenant because it's a way of showing value. I think we don't have this thing where you cut stuff. And again, that's where we've totally lost this. Again, in Hebrew, you cannot make a covenant. You can't sign into a neighborhood covenant. I mean, I signed one of those, but in Hebrew, you can't do that. You have to cut these things. Maybe this is like being a blood brother in the native tradition, where you each literally cut yourselves and you commingle the act of bleeding. I'm not really sure. Maybe nobody wants to talk about that either. I don't know if you've ever considered, you don't really have to do anything in the baptismal covenant except say some stuff. And I don't know if you know this, but for the first 250 years that like Christianity was around, it wasn't called Christianity, it was called the Way at first. But if you wanted to be baptized, you had to apply and be evaluated for 2 years by a mentor. And like, if you weren't a good folk, they just would say no. I don't know that I believe in that kind of exclusivity, but that's a little more covenantal, right? Like you got to do something.
So in the baptism covenant we use, we do something because we promise to bring the child up in the way, right?
We make that promise, yeah. And I wish we had an institutionalized way of living into that promise. You know? I mean, I think the people who tend to keep that promise, you hope, are the parents and the godparents. And like maybe if you're a Sunday school teacher, I don't know. Like I think a lot of us just don't know how to do it. And part of it maybe is pace of life and like the fact that people rotate in and out a lot more than we used to, you know. I think maybe you used to have like a small village parish and that was a little bit easier, like takes a village to raise this kid and like we did that. And I don't know, it seems important though that we remember, like you're saying, I think that seems really important. Kathy, please.
Well, I was just thinking two things. Yes, I definitely made covenants with my friends with the cutting and.
Did you really? Like you did like the blood brother thing? Okay.
Yeah, I did. I bet other people did too, really. I can't.
Yeah.
But anyway, talking about baptismal covenant, I had a wonderful godmother who really helped bring me up in the church. My mother did as well, but my godmother, and my mother made sure that I took my godmother gifts and that we stayed connected. And we lived in the same community. But my godson, I have one godchild, moved away, and I have been a terrible godmother. So he's already grown and was raised in the faith by his parents, I know, but anyway, I guess that's just a confession. I think being a godparent is serious, but it is not as easy as it was because we move and separate physically. It's not in community. And that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think it's become increasingly difficult to do that. This is still, and you've heard me say this before, and I have it as an idea and I don't know what to do with it, but I wish we could really figure out a way as a parish to mentor our children and youth and young people, and not just through Sunday school, but to make like an intentional program that says, look, would you like to be mentored by an adult in the parish? And yes, I'm willing to be a mentor. And we talk about faith and our education and table manners so that we can have additional adult perspectives outside of the one that we grew up with in the house and grow to be fuller people. And I don't know how to do it. Because I didn't get that. I got informal mentorship, which was people who like took an interest in me, or I took enough interest in them to like ask those kind of questions or pursue them. But I think some formality maybe would be really helpful. I mean, we have a whole lot of life experience and compassion and wisdom just on the screen. And this is like 10% of our parish right here. I mean, I don't know if my son would have wanted a formal mentorship, but you better believe I would have bent over backwards to get him in a formal mentorship with any one of you.
So when we were living in West Virginia, our oldest son, Travis, was confirmed in the Episcopal Church there. We had switched from the Lutheran Church to the Episcopal Church. And their program had an adult with every child, not just one leader, but an adult with every single child. And he was very blessed because he got a gentleman that really took an interest in doing this. And they met once a week for, I don't remember how long, but quite a while. And then the whole group would meet as well. And I thought it was a great program.
I love the idea. And you know, there's these programs out there that are like preparing for confirmation that do that for like 13 weeks. And I think what I wish that you could do is like 13 years of that and switch mentors each year. I know, I mean, really switch mentors each year, because you think about what a young person would leave a congregation with when they go to work or college is they'd know 13 adults, or they'd know 5, you know, that care about them deeply. And these are adults who are willing to say like, look, here are my doubts and here are my practices. And this is, you know, like, I I just don't know I don't know where you find that. I don't know where you find that. And I don't even know how to get going. I just wish we did it. It's going to sound funny, so forgive me, because I know whatever, I would rather have my kid get that than go to youth group for their whole career.
I'll make a comment on that. I think my kids got it in the choir.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was their choice to do something with the adults. And they're wonderful mentors in that group and have been. And, you know, I think it's, I don't know how you orchestrate like throwing people together like that. Because the other thing that came to mind for me was we have two other couples who we've been friends with for, I don't know, 40 years. We each had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And our kids are within about a 10-year, so the 6 kids in about a 10-year span. We didn't ever live in the same area while we had children, but vacation together every year. And I guarantee you that my kids felt like that about the other adults in that group. Yeah. And, you know, it was some of them, I mean, some of those were godparents, but not all of them. And, I don't know how you actually plan that, or, you know, I think we were just lucky.
Yeah. Darlene, you know, tell us.
When my son was in early grade school and needed male companionship and guidance, I tried to sign him up for Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I didn't have anything church-wise that would fulfill that role. And so I looked for the community and to the community, and the waiting list was so long for a big brother for Jamie that I was at work at a local hospital, and I was lamenting the fact, and several people knew that that my son needed some help. And there was this wonderful Black man, tall, thin, young, who was a psych tech. And he came to me and said, I would be glad to fulfill that role. And so he volunteered and was a mentor for my son for years. Even after he moved, he still stayed in contact with Jamie. So there are people out there who are willing to give of themselves. It's just making that connection that is so hard. So I'm really grateful to that man who filled that need for my son.
Well, my thinking is if we could develop some kind of like outline of what this could look like, we could just invite community members to apply, you know, and maybe nobody does. And maybe that's awkward, but geez, you know, I mean, this seems like good work that we could be doing. I have a really good former student of mine who's a friend now, and we met. I taught him at a conservative evangelical Christian school called Christian High, and the dad of the family was like an interpreter for the NIV, like he was one of those scholars. Mom does she does this kind of counseling called oh man, I just blanked on. Anyway, she's a therapist. They're both really thoughtful, pious, careful people. And my student was telling me, former student was telling me about his Christmas break, and I asked about his brother, and he was like, yeah, it's hard to believe my brother's 22, and he brought his boyfriend home. And I said, really? And he was like, yeah, like he didn't, he kind of discovered, goes to Pepperdine, and he was able to discover this part of himself. And I said, oh, that has to be really hard, because when my wife applied to Pepperdine, there was no gay student union or anything. You couldn't have it. And that's been a long time ago. And he told me that like when his brother was in high school, that wasn't a thing you could talk about. And I realized like, it's not just that you want to talk to your peers, like you like to be able to talk to somebody with wisdom and maturity who won't cut you off, you know? It's not just parents are okay, like they rallied around their kid and like all that's fine, you know, and brother is not even quite sure where his brother is, but you know, being supportive and it seems like I don't use him as a highlight. Those are the kinds of situations that our kids, where are they going to turn to for wisdom and maturity? If they don't have somebody wise, they'll turn to their peers. And that's tough. Susan?
I'm thinking about when when Cindy Tomet's mother passed away, and we were friends, and that left the children without a grandparent here.
Yes.
They had grandparents in other states, but so I kind of just stepped in to be a grandparent to these kids. And it has been wonderful for me. And I hope it has been wonderful for them.
Of course it has.
Right now, Anne Marie is a teenager, you know, and I know that there are things going on in her life that are stressful. And we go out to dinner about every 2 weeks. And she knows that she can talk to me and I will keep her, you know, confidences, unless I think it's going to harm her.
Yeah.
But, you know, just to be another adult that you can talk to. And it wasn't, you know, set up or anything, but I think what you're looking at is something that we really ought to consider.
And just
to do that.
Thank you. And just to reconnect, right? You're talking about cutting a covenant with time, which is something precious to all of us, and remembering people in our midst. And the Hebrew words use this word elder, right? The elders sit at the gate. Those are the judges. There's no courts. The elders are the judges. They just happen to be the people with the most experience and wisdom. And remembering elders with our youth, it seems like a pretty important opportunity for our baptismal covenant. Do we want to talk about walking? Is that helpful? The halakha? That's still like a Jewish way. You walk the Torah, you journey it. It's like more important than, like we usually think like you keep the Torah, like a bunch of set of rules. No, it's you're supposed to walk the way, like you journey the way. And there's this other word, shomer, like you guard or advocate for. So you know that story where Cain kills his brother and God says, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" That word keeper is the word shomer, which is like shepherd or guardian. You're supposed to be a shomer of the Torah. You're supposed to be a shomer of the Sabbath. And you do that by walking it, if that makes sense, rather than like checking off principles, like you travel the way.
It seems to be a much more active, involved operation than just keeping.
I think so. And you know, there's this really interesting thing. The guy talks about God journeying with the people. That kind of got lost with the institution of the temple. You'd think heretofore, like God was on parade. You know, it would be sort of like having church in everybody's house and in different parks each week as a reminder that like sanctuaries really ought to exist all around, you know, which is a great thing to do. There's this thing that happens when the people go to Babylon, and maybe you've read about it in Ezekiel. I don't know if you've read Ezekiel before, but in the first chapter, Ezekiel has a vision of a wheel and the wheel and the wheel in the sky. I don't know if you've read this before. And this thing's pulling the wheel and the wheel and the wheel are like these four-headed things, like four-faced things. They have like a donkey and an ox and an eagle and a human face, and they're covered with eyeballs. And those are cherubim. And the whole wheel and the wheel and the thing is weird, but it's like called God's throne chariot, the Merkava, which is sort of like when the people get taken away, God goes with them. That was a new idea. And it's helpful to hear that people thought about gods as being regional, So when you left Syria, Palestine, and went to Egypt, now there were the gods of Egypt. That was their dominion, their household. And it was very geographic. So to hear that God journeys with them in this throne chariot is really defying that idea, like God travels with you into exile. And God sees what's going on everywhere, hence all the eyeballs and the four faces and all of that. So to think that God walks the way with you, it's not that you're walking on a journey to God, it's that you're journeying with God and God is journeying with you. It's part of this halakhic understanding of the Torah. That's why we say at the end, at the Eucharist, walk in love. As Christ loved us and gave himself for us, right? I mean, that's a reminder of like how we're supposed to journey, not by checking boxes, but like like a compass direction.
Well, I thought the side of geography there was really interesting, and that walking was not like, walking around the block in my neighborhood, that it was more like hiking, that it was much more strenuous and difficult than what, I as a modern American see as walking. And that walking had up and down as part of the word structure, that I always thought, when you get up to go somewhere, that meant you like stood up, not that you like walked up.
Yeah, it's funny when you think about like what we think walking is for compared to that was the way to go anywhere and meet your needs and do your economy. And we have cars for that, right? Like walking is an exercise, or it's a privilege or a luxury, or we just can't be bothered to do it, right? And that was just what you did to go anywhere.
Yeah, and years ago we went to South Africa to take my mother-in-law's ashes home to her original country, and when you're there, people are walking everywhere. Yeah, we would be driving out in the middle of nowhere, and there'd be this path, and you could see this one person just journeying out, to somewhere, clearly, that but all the time, all over the place. That was how you get from point A to point B.
Yeah, I think there's people, I don't know, Donna, your experience of living in the Netherlands, but when we lived in Germany, like we either took the train, we might have had a bicycle, which would be like a horse. But in general, we did a lot of walking, and particularly like I walked to the grocery store every day because it was 2 blocks away, right? Like when you live in a sort of mixed use zone, what you do, and cars are really expensive, especially when you don't have one.
Even if you have one, there's nowhere to park them. So most of the time you just walk. Best shape I've been in, I think, in my life, because you walk everywhere. Or you take the tram or whatever, but you don't spend so much time sitting in a car.
Maybe that makes a good natural bridge to horses, not just as vehicles, but military might, right? Like horses are like F-16s. And repeatedly you get told, don't trust in F-16s, trust in the Lord. It's a good reminder.
I thought the horse one was so interesting because I guess I just not thought in terms in the Bible that we don't see people riding horses in the Bible. If you think about it, you realize they rode donkeys some, but I had not really put that into, this didn't happen then, right? So I thought it was a very interesting topic, and it made me kind of wonder, like, when all that transition happened, where, they switched to start riding these animals, and I don't know.
I can tell you that if you want to know. Well, I should tell you that the Hebrew Bible is full of anachronisms, right? Like when you read about the clock face in Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play, there were no clocks in the Roman era. but his audience was used to clocks. So you put that in. So even like when you hear that Abraham sent his servant up to get Isaac a wife with camels, I mean, camels weren't domesticated at that time. It's definitely an anachronism. Horses are a funny thing, right? Like people figured out pretty early that a horse could pull something like a cart, just like an ox can. And so that's where you get chariots. And usually we think of chariots as being like these ancient tanks, but you know, when wheels are made out of wood and roads are non-existent made out of cobblestones, the chariots break really quickly. And all a chariot really was a portable archery platform that allowed you to kind of take some shots and then back away and take some more shots. I mean, it was a huge military advantage, but people in general, horses didn't pull chariots to battle. People carried them like rickshaws. And then right before the battle, they hooked it up to the horse. Because if the horse brought it the whole way, the axles would break. So like, we don't even think through that business. And part of it is the horse, unlike the ox, breathes through its nose. The ox breathes through its mouth. So if you tried to put a bridle and a bit in an ox's mouth, you'd suffocate it. And this is like super simple sounding now, but people didn't figure that out for a long time. And man, when you don't have a bridle in a horse's mouth, like you better be a horse whisperer, you know, because they're not like easy to train animals. I just want to make sure you all know that. Like they're kind of contrary, tough things. So we know for sure that when the Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire came down to invade modern day Israel, that is the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, those people didn't know how to ride a horse, but the Babylonians did. And you know that if you read 1 Kings, they taunt them openly. We'll give you a bunch of horses like you even know how to ride them because they didn't know. They thought you could just pull a cart with a horse. So somewhere around 800 to 600 is when people figure out like saddle and rein technology. I don't know if that's helpful to hear. And so when you hear David rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, I think I mentioned this in a sermon before on Palm Sunday, you only ride on a donkey when the fight's over, because a donkey is worse than being on feet. You know, foot soldiers can like roll and dive. I mean, donkeys are called asses for a reason, or stubborn as a mule. Like you hear those kinds of things. I mean, donkeys aren't particularly tall, so they don't give you much of a height advantage. They're stronger than a human being, but they're not particularly nimble or agile. You know, think about a horse, and particularly when you've got like a war horse, you can ride on top of people and they can just step on people and crush them. And you've got all of this height advantage with a lance and with a sword, but you can only do that if the horse has a bit and bridle and a really good saddle. And again, like that wasn't the case for a long time. They were just chariots and they didn't work well on roads. And you can see this theme, right? I mean, the Egyptians come after the people and God defeats their technology by putting mud. Right? I mean, like they didn't know how to ride through mud. And you can read that in Judges when Deborah tells them to go into battle against these iron chariots. I mean, that's really like where people with slingshots defeat tanks, because the tanks they get stuck in the mud and they can't turn. And so the Israelites are able to win the battle. I mean, basically, you're hearing these stories about Stone Age people fighting Iron Age people.
So Mike, at the crossing of the Red Sea, when the Pharaoh's chariots and chariot drivers, does that mean that like the people were pulling the chariots at that point and not the horses, so that they like really couldn't get back out when the water closed?
It's a distinct possibility. The other possibility would be even how totally reckless Pharaoh was, because if you try to ride people down in a chariot, you're going to break your chariots. So I think you could read it either way. This is like totally self-destructive.
Wow. Okay, that's a perspective I've never had before. That's cool.
You know, we like one of the things we don't learn in seminary, I don't know why, is the development of these like tactics between like Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. You know, you just hear this and like, what difference does that make for battling? And to be honest, like a flint arrowhead and an iron arrowhead are both going to be really effective when fired out of a bow at your skin. Right? I mean, what difference does that really make? And what we don't realize is you hear about people with swords, but you know, bronze is such a scarce metal that the only people that had bronze blades are like princes and kings, and everybody else had like sticks with nails sticking out of them. I mean, like that was the weapon franca. And even in the Iron Age, right? People didn't know, the early Iron Age, iron's really abundant, but people didn't know how to smelt it very well. So like we think about steel and how strong that is. That's a modern invention. Ancient people, when you hear that they had iron chariots, please don't think that they had like battleships pulled by horses. I mean, they were wood with some metal nails. And a metal nail is a really big improvement over not nails. Like, I don't know if you realize this, if you've worked with wood, like modern glue is stronger than the wood. But 60 years ago, glue was pretty crappy. I mean, glue is just really weak. Now, glue has created IKEA because that's all IKEA is a bunch of like sawdust and wood. And glue, sorry, sawdust and glue. And you press that together and it's all right until you try to assemble it, right? And then that's where it gets real interesting. But I mean, Antho, that broader perspective, like archaeologically speaking, it's kind of missing. And we love to read anachronisms into scripture because we imagine these like really great chariots like you see in the movie Ben-Hur. Well, by the time you got to that movie Ben-Hur, people figured out how to make weapons out of iron that wouldn't like bend when you struck them against another one. But you hear about this early iron, like the Philistines had, they didn't have iron blades. That was way too weak. I mean, their smelting temperature was like 600 degrees. I've got a grill at my house that I can get hotter than like early Philistine fires. And the Philistines, they were like first world people and the Hebrews were like third world people, to put that in perspective. So when you hear that Jesus went in on Palm Sunday riding on a donkey, it's an image he's already won. You would never try to take a city on donkey back. Never. I don't know if household was interesting or if the gate was interesting for you as we kind of wrap up. I will tell you gate matters when you think about crosses, because old cities had walls and the point was not to have a lot of gates. So when you hear Jesus is crucified outside the city wall, that's like the ancient billboard, right? Everybody has to go through the gate to come in and out of the city. Most people live outside the city. They only come in during siege. That's where markets are. So you bring all your stuff in, you leave at the end of the day. So when you walk by crosses, you're just getting this constant ancient advert. This is what happens when you mess with Rome. Courts are held at the gate, and I don't know if this is helpful to remember as well, but like police forces are like 150 years old. I mean, really. We often think like, oh, like there's always been police. Nope. That's why if you read American law, maybe you've heard of something called the citizen's arrest. Like all arrests were citizen's arrests until like 100 years ago. Maybe army, like soldiers could arrest you, but not special status because they were a soldier. That was a citizen's arrest, or because their local potentate told them to go like beat you up. I mean, but that's not any kind of like policing as we understand it. All right, well, I hope this is fun. I'm grateful you keep coming back anyway.
Makes me want to go back to Jerusalem.
I want to go back to Jerusalem. I think it'd be really fun. Yep. Well, I'm sure we will. We're not going to go this year. Yeah. But maybe in 2 years we can make it. I mean, that would be really nice, you know, or maybe we could go to Egypt or something. That's what we talked about while we were in Jordan, how, hey, you know, like going to Egypt gives you a connection, or Greece or something like that. You know, it's really helpful when you go somewhere and see like, oh, that's how it looked. Like the first time I landed in Israel, I was like, why would anybody fight over this? Like it is so brown.
Yeah.
It is.
Mike, when they discuss the houses and the architect of the houses, one of the things that they made note was that that extended families live together. I mean, you would have you know, many generations living in the same house. And I remember when we were in Jordan and to a degree in Israel, but I've seen it in other countries as well. Houses built and houses built in a block fashion, but on the top of the house, you have a bunch of columns with rebar sticking out of the top. And my understanding is that that's so that they can build another floor for another generation. Yes. I found that to be fascinating.
It's a really cool way of doing something they didn't quite do back then, because as you know, like architectural members weren't particularly strong, so you couldn't continue to build up. Instead, what it seems like extended families lived in compounds, and contrary to our understanding, it wasn't like there was the patriarch and matriarch lived in one. Like the women had a house and the men had a house, and really weird, like that they had different roles, because we usually think, oh, the patriarch dominated everything. And this is really helpful when you go back and read that women controlled fertility and marriage. I mean, for their daughters and for their sons. So when you go back and read Genesis 2, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and become united. That doesn't mean he'll go live with the bride's family. It means maybe they'll get their own home in the family compound, if that makes sense. And sometimes we have images where a new couple will move into the mother's house because she's the one who made the match.
The other remembrance, if you will, that I have was when we were in Israel. You took us into a, I think it was more of a cave than anything else. But anyway, you said that this was more likely where Jesus was born amongst the animals, and that, again, the people lived above the animals, and for obvious reasons. But I found that to be fascinating.
You know, it's really weird, John, that you mentioned that, because when I wrote my book on Luke, I talked about how Luke talks about there's no room at the inn, and really that talks about there being a second floor that's a guest room, and the guest room was already full. So it wasn't like Jesus was going to go be born in a hotel. It really was the guest room. So you're thinking about like the Jordanian house where you'd build a room above your house for guests, but look, that was already full. So Jesus was born on the main floor. Like here's the image that you get. Is you've got like a half floor, and here's the animals in the house. This is supposed to be a cow. It's terrible. And the cow eats high, you know, eats at like a 3-foot level. The cow can't jump up there. It's not going to. This is up here is where the people live. Here's the manger. So Jesus is born there, like in the house. That's what Luke says. But, you know, a lot of people are saying Jesus was born in that grotto, like in Bethlehem. Remember, we went out to the Palestinian city in Bethlehem. There is that church, remember, that had that silver star, and there's that kind of black center. And that would be probably based more on Luke's gospel, the idea that there was a house. But a lot of people are saying he was born in one of those caves, those cave grottos, and we got to see both, you know. A part of what's important to remember with the Bible is it's more concerned with us getting the concept than getting the bare facts. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. Kathy?
Well, I was just going to say that Lauren and I slept in a place I would call the manger of a guest house in Italy. And, you know, the manger side was alongside and our bed was alongside that, but was built on a hillside. So we could exit out and we had a nice little patio out there. But yeah, it was cool to be in what made me think of the manger where Jesus was born, because it was like all stone or something.
Yeah, it had like a feeding trough built in to one of the walls.
Yeah.
And that's what we thought about, you know, that's where the animals lived.
Yeah.
So one more fun thought about mangers, you know, that just occurred to me is we usually think like, oh, poor Jesus, he got laid in the hay. I mean, everybody slept on the ground. The hay was much better than sleeping on the ground. My wife, when she was born in rural Maine, like the mattress was made out of corn cobs, you know, so like this is helpful to think, like by putting Jesus like in the hay, he had a better bed than mom and dad. Or he had the same kind of bed, because mattresses didn't have springs. There was no thermodynamic Tempur-Pedic. I mean, you slept on corn cobs and hay, and not even corn cobs, because they hadn't discovered those in the New World yet. So, you know, we can read Jesus was born in the worst circumstances, but I think we're missing the story, which is Jesus was born in the middle of everything. Okay, well, next week, boy, we're almost done. We'll talk about cultural values with chapter 8. And of course, one of the most important words we're going to tackle is the word shalom, which is great. So I will wish you in advance shalom until next week. And you'll find out what that means if you want next week.